The Ammonites were an ancient Semitic people who lived east of the Jordan River, known both for their fierce conflicts with Israel and their terrifying religious practices. According to biblical tradition, they trace their origins to Ben Ammi, the son of Lot and his younger daughter, born in the aftermath of Sodom and Gomorrah, as told in Genesis chapter 19, verse 38. Over centuries, the Ammonites developed a kingdom centered on Rabbath Ammon, engaged in warfare and diplomacy with neighboring peoples, and worshipped gods whose rituals, especially those associated with Milcom, provoked fear and moral condemnation among their neighbors. Their story is one of survival, political complexity, and a religious system that has fascinated historians and theologians for millennia, a people born of tragedy. The origins of the Ammonites are rooted in a story of isolation, fear, and survival, as recorded in the Hebrew Bible. After the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot, the nephew of Abraham, fled with his 2 daughters into the hills, seeking refuge from the devastation that had engulfed the plain of Jordan. This was no ordinary flight. The daughters feared the end of their family line, believing themselves cut off from the possibility of marriage and descendants. In an act that has horrified generations of readers, both daughters conspired to intoxicate their father, ensuring that they could conceive and preserve the lineage of Lot. From the union of Lot with his younger daughter was born Ben Ammi, whose name means son of my people, and who would become the patriarch of the nation later known as the Ammonites, as described in Genesis chapter 19, verse 38. This narrative situates the Ammonites in a moral and cultural framework that emphasizes both their shared ancestry with Israel and a distinct, morally complex identity. The story of Ben Ammi is not merely a genealogical note. It functions as a lens through which the ancient Israelites understood their neighbors. Scholars such as Joel S. Burnett suggest that framing the Ammonites' ancestry as a product of transgression served both theological and political purposes. It acknowledged a shared Semitic origin, while simultaneously casting the Ammonites in a morally compromised light, reinforcing Israelite notions of religious and ethical superiority. The narrative also sets a precedent for understanding the Ammonites' later social and religious behaviors as divergent from Israelite norms. Their legendary origin story, therefore, is both historical myth and cultural commentary, shaping perceptions of the Ammonites for centuries. Archaeological evidence confirms that by the 1st millennium BCE, the Ammonites had established a stable, organized society in the highlands east of the Jordan River. Excavations in and around modern-day Amman, ancient Rabbath Ammon, have revealed fortifications, administrative buildings, and inscriptions that indicate a hierarchical society capable of complex governance. These findings suggest that the legendary narrative of Ben Ammi's birth was followed by generations of organized settlement, agricultural development, and political centralization. The Ammonites were no longer merely a mythic people. They were a historical nation interacting with neighboring cultures and emerging kingdoms. In addition to settlement, the Ammonites developed a distinct cultural identity that blended inherited Semitic traits with local innovations. Their language, closely related to Hebrew and Moabite, allowed them to maintain communication across the Transjordanian plateau and engage in both trade and diplomacy. Ritual practices, social hierarchies, and kinship networks were all integral to their survival and expansion. Despite being neighbors to Israel, Moab, and Edom, the Ammonites retained an identity that was both connected and separate, reflecting the duality present in their founding legend. Born of the same patriarchal lineage as Israel, yet distinguished by circumstances and moral framing. The moral undertones of the Ammonite origin story also appear in later biblical texts, which portray the Ammonites as frequently in conflict with Israel. Their legendary birth from Lot and his daughters symbolized a people whose beginnings were fraught with transgression, foreshadowing the recurring themes of rivalry, warfare, and religious divergence that would define Ammonite-Israelite relations for centuries. In historical memory, the Ammonites were never simply neighbors. They were a people whose roots were entwined with both kinship and perceived moral corruption, making them simultaneously familiar and alien to Israelite writers and audiences. Finally, the birth of the Ammonites underscores the broader dynamics of origin narratives in the ancient Near East. Like many other peoples of the region, the Ammonite story blends history, legend, and moral instruction. It situates them in the landscape of ancient Semitic civilization while establishing a framework through which their neighbors could interpret their social, political, and religious actions. The tragic and morally complex birth of Ben Ammi and the emergence of the Ammonite people thus becomes not only a story of survival, but also a foundational narrative that shapes how the Ammonites were understood by history, scripture, and archaeology alike. Geography and the heartland of Ammon. The Ammonites occupied a region of strategic and economic significance east of the Jordan River in what is today the northern highlands of Jordan. Their territory extended from the fertile valleys along the Jabbok River to the rugged highlands surrounding Rabbath Ammon, the city that later became modern-day Amman. This region offered a unique combination of agricultural potential, defensible terrain, and access to trade routes that connected the Levant with Mesopotamia and the Arabian Peninsula. The highlands were crisscrossed with smaller towns and villages, including Medeba, Heshbon, and Aroer, which functioned both as administrative centres and as waypoints for commerce and military campaigns. The placement of these settlements allowed the Ammonites to exercise control over both local resources and the movement of peoples and goods through the region, establishing a foundation for political and military power. The topography of Ammonite territory provided distinct advantages. The elevated highlands offered protection against invaders, while valleys and river plains supported agriculture, including the cultivation of cereals such as wheat and barley. Archaeological surveys indicate extensive terracing along hillsides, suggesting sophisticated agricultural techniques designed to maximize arable land in a mountainous environment. Livestock farming was also central to the Ammonite economy, with sheep, goats, and cattle providing meat, milk, hides, and wool. This combination of agriculture and pastoralism allowed the Ammonites to sustain a growing population and a structured society capable of organizing both civil and military affairs. The Jabbok River, running through the heart of Ammonite territory, was not only a source of water but also a natural boundary separating Ammon from neighboring peoples such as the Moabites and Israelites. Control over this river and its surrounding valleys allowed the Ammonites to monitor, and at times restrict the movement of hostile forces. This strategic positioning became particularly important during periods of conflict with Israel, when the Ammonites used the terrain to their advantage in defensive operations. Biblical texts often reference the Jabbok as a site of military significance, highlighting the interplay between geography and historical events. Rabbath Ammon, the capital, served as the political and religious center of the kingdom. Excavations in modern Amman reveal evidence of monumental architecture, administrative buildings, and fortifications, indicating a complex urban society with organized governance. Royal inscriptions and seal impressions from the first millennium BCE provide further insight into the administrative sophistication of the city. These artifacts suggest that the Ammonite rulers maintained authority over a network of towns and villages, collecting tribute, regulating trade, and overseeing religious institutions that reinforced the political hierarchy. Rabbath Ammon was not simply a city. It was the symbolic heart of Ammonite identity, a place where politics, religion, and culture converged. The Ammonites shared borders with several neighboring peoples, including the Moabites to the south, the Edomites to the southeast, and the Israelites to the west. These neighbors were both rivals and occasional allies, and the geography of Ammonite territory shaped these relationships. The highlands provided defensible positions, while valleys facilitated trade and communication. Scholars such as William F. Albright note that the Ammonites' location allowed them to engage in both conflict and diplomacy, reflecting a nuanced understanding of regional politics. Their geographic position required constant negotiation of alliances and enmities, which in turn influenced their military organization and urban planning. Trade was a crucial aspect of Ammonite society, facilitated by their geographic position along routes connecting Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Arabia. Archaeological finds, including imported ceramics, inscriptions, and luxury goods, indicate active participation in regional commerce. Ammonite merchants likely traded agricultural products, textiles, and livestock in exchange for metals, pottery, and other valuable commodities. The kingdom's location not only provided economic sustenance but also exposed it to cultural and religious influences from neighboring regions, shaping both material culture and spiritual practices. The influx of foreign goods and ideas contributed to a syncretic religious system, blending indigenous worship with elements borrowed from neighboring cultures. The geography of Ammon served as a backdrop for the kingdom's enduring identity. The combination of fertile land, defensible terrain, and access to trade routes allowed the Ammonites to thrive politically, economically, and culturally. Their control over the highlands east of the Jordan River enabled them to resist external domination for centuries, even as larger empires such as Assyria and Babylon expanded into the region. By understanding the landscape of Ammon, historians gain insight into how geography shaped not only the Ammonites' economic and political development, but also the conditions under which their religious practices, including the worship of Milcom, evolved and became central to their societal identity. From nomads to kingdom, the Ammonites' rise from loosely organized clans to a centralized kingdom is a story that unfolds across centuries of the Iron Age, roughly circa 1000 BCE to 500 BCE, and reflects both the pressures of their environment and the opportunities of regional politics. Early Ammonite society was likely composed of semi-nomadic tribes, relying on a combination of pastoralism and small-scale agriculture. Archaeological surveys in the Transjordan highlands reveal settlements characterized by simple stone structures, storage pits for grain, and corrals for livestock, indicating a society in transition from mobile herding to sedentary village life. The shift toward permanent settlement facilitated the development of local governance, religious institutions, and social hierarchies that would form the basis of the Ammonite kingdom. By the late 1st millennium BCE, the Ammonites had established a recognizable political structure centered on Rabbath Ammon, their capital, which functioned as both administrative and ceremonial heart. Excavations of fortifications and public buildings in modern Amman reveal evidence of urban planning, suggesting the existence of a royal court and a bureaucratic elite capable of coordinating trade, taxation, and military organization. Inscriptions from this period, often carved into stone seals and monumental stelae, confirm the existence of kings such as Peduel, Barachel, and Hisalel, whose names reflect both personal authority and religious devotion, as several of them incorporate divine elements like El or Milcom in their titles. These rulers were not merely tribal chiefs, but monarchs who claimed authority over a structured kingdom and exercised influence over surrounding towns and rural territories. The Ammonite kings appear repeatedly in the annals of regional politics, often as both allies and adversaries of the Israelites and neighboring peoples. During the reign of King David, according to the Hebrew Bible, the Ammonites were engaged in multiple conflicts with Israel, requiring military campaigns to secure Israelite borders. Later, under King Saul, Ammonite incursions into Israelite territory prompted organized retaliation, demonstrating that the Ammonites were capable of mobilizing significant armed forces. These military engagements reflect not only the strategic importance of the Ammonite plateau, but also the kingdom's political sophistication, as rulers were able to coordinate both defensive and offensive operations in response to regional pressures. The economy of the emerging Ammonite kingdom was closely tied to both agriculture and trade. Terraced fields and pastoral lands provided food security, while the kingdom's position along trade routes between Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Arabia enabled the exchange of luxury goods, metals, and crafted items. Archaeological evidence, including imported pottery and inscriptions referencing merchants, indicates that Ammonite elites were actively engaged in commerce. Trade brought not only wealth but also cultural influences, including religious and artistic ideas that shaped the kingdom's identity. The synthesis of local tradition and external influence is evident in both material culture and religious practice, with shrines and temples reflecting a combination of indigenous worship and borrowed motifs from neighboring civilizations. Religion was inseparable from political authority in the Ammonite kingdom. Kings were not only rulers but also intermediaries between the people and the gods. The chief deity, Milcom, occupied a central place in royal ideology, with inscriptions suggesting that kings performed rituals and made offerings to secure divine favor for both governance and military success. Religious ceremonies, possibly including sacrifices and public festivals, reinforced the authority of the monarch and unified disparate tribal groups under a common religious identity. Scholars such as William F. Albright have emphasized that the integration of religion and kingship in Ammonite society mirrors broader patterns in the ancient Near East, where divine endorsement legitimized temporal power and ensured social cohesion. Interactions with neighboring kingdoms also influenced Ammonite state formation. Conflicts and alliances with Israel, Moab, and Edom shaped both military strategy and diplomatic policy. The Ammonites were capable of negotiating treaties, paying tribute when necessary, and forming temporary alliances to resist larger imperial powers such as Assyria. In the late 8th century BCE, inscriptions indicate that King Pejuel acknowledged Assyrian suzerainty, demonstrating that Ammonite rulers were adept at navigating the complexities of regional geopolitics. These interactions, while sometimes humiliating, allowed the kingdom to survive and maintain a distinct cultural and political identity amid larger, more powerful neighbours. By the end of the first millennium BCE, the Ammonites had fully transitioned from nomadic tribes to a centralized kingdom with urban centers, complex administration, military capacity, and religious institutions. Their evolution was a response to environmental pressures, economic opportunity, and the demands of regional politics. The kingdom's foundation laid the groundwork for centuries of interaction with neighboring peoples and empires, shaping both the historical record and biblical memory of the Ammonites as a people both familiar and morally distinct from Israel. The story of their rise from pastoral clans to a structured kingdom demonstrates not only their adaptability, but also the intertwined nature of politics, religion, and culture in the ancient Near East, language, identity, and early society. The Ammonites were not only defined by their territory and political organization, but also by a distinct cultural and linguistic identity that linked them to the broader Canaanite world while simultaneously setting them apart. Their language, known as Ammonite, was a northwest Semitic dialect closely related to Hebrew, Moabite, and Phoenician. Surviving inscriptions, including royal seals and monumental texts, dating from circa 850 BCE to 600 BCE, reveal the structure of their writing system, which employed characters derived from the Proto-Canaanite alphabet. These inscriptions, often engraved on stone stelae or clay seals, provide not only names of kings and officials but also insights into religious dedications, territorial boundaries, and economic transactions. Linguists studying these texts note subtle differences in spelling and vocabulary that distinguish Ammonite from neighboring tongues, suggesting a deliberate effort to assert a unique identity while remaining intelligible across the region. Language, however, was only one aspect of Ammonite identity. Archaeological evidence from settlements across the Transjordanian Plateau, including Rabbath Ammon, Medeba, and Heshbon, indicates a society that blended nomadic traditions with urban and agricultural practices. Houses were typically constructed of mud brick over stone foundations, with storage spaces for grain and livestock pens integrated into domestic compounds. These settlements reflect a continuity of earlier nomadic practices alongside increasing social complexity, including the emergence of local elites and specialized craftsmen. Scholars argue that this hybrid lifestyle allowed the Ammonites to adapt to both environmental pressures and the demands of regional trade networks, fostering a resilient and cohesive society capable of withstanding external threats. Social hierarchy was another defining feature of Ammonite society. Royal inscriptions and seal impressions indicate the presence of a king, provincial officials, and religious authorities who together maintained governance, law, and ritual. Kings such as Pejuel, Barachel, and Hisalel, whose reigns spanned the first millennium BCE, held titles that emphasized divine favor, linking their authority to the gods they served. The incorporation of divine elements into royal names suggests that Ammonite rulers derived political legitimacy from religious devotion, reinforcing social cohesion and ensuring loyalty among the population. This intertwining of religious and political authority was not unique to Ammon, but the consistency with which it appears in inscriptions demonstrates the centrality of the king as both a temporal and spiritual figure. Religious practice was inseparable from cultural identity. The Ammonites worshipped a pantheon dominated by Milcom, a god associated with kingship, protection, and possibly fertility. Archaeological excavations near Rabbath Ammon and other major centers have uncovered altars, shrines, and statues interpreted as representing Milcom, often alongside smaller cultic objects linked to subordinate deities or ancestor veneration. Inscriptions indicate that offerings were made to Milcom in exchange for military victory, agricultural abundance, and protection of the kingdom. While some biblical authors, particularly in 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 7 and 2 Kings chapter 23 verse 10, portray these practices as morally abhorrent, they were integral to the Ammonite sense of identity and social cohesion, binding the community together through shared ritual observance. Trade and cultural exchange further shaped Ammonite identity. The kingdom's location along trade routes connecting the Levant with Mesopotamia and Arabia facilitated the introduction of foreign goods, ideas, and religious motifs. Imported pottery, metalwork, and luxury items have been found at Ammonite sites, reflecting both economic prosperity and the assimilation of external influences into local culture. Scholars such as William F. Albright and Joel S. Burnett emphasize that these interactions contributed to a syncretic society in which indigenous beliefs were adapted alongside external customs, producing a distinct cultural expression that was recognizably Ammonite, yet informed by the wider Near Eastern milieu. Gender roles and family structures also contributed to Ammonite social identity. Inscriptions occasionally reference women in administrative and religious capacities, suggesting that royal and elite women played important roles in cultic practices, including the supervision of temple activities and the transmission of ritual knowledge. Household archaeology indicates that domestic spaces were organized to accommodate extended families and agricultural production, reflecting a society in which familial and economic responsibilities were closely linked. The combination of domestic organization, religious observance, and hierarchical governance created a multi-layered identity in which loyalty to the king, devotion to the gods, and participation in communal life were mutually reinforcing. Finally, the linguistic, social, and cultural markers of Ammonite identity positioned the kingdom both as part of the broader Canaanite world and as a distinct entity. Their language facilitated communication and trade while asserting uniqueness, their social hierarchy maintained order and cohesion, and their religious practices reinforced political authority and community belonging. Together, these elements created a resilient society capable of surviving centuries of regional conflict and cultural change. Understanding Ammonite identity in this comprehensive way allows historians and archaeologists to appreciate the depth and complexity of a people often remembered primarily for their conflicts with Israel and their worship of gods that later traditions considered horrifying. Religion and the gods of Ammon. Religion formed the core of Ammonite society, shaping both individual identity and the authority of the state. At the center of their spiritual life stood Milcom, also known in some biblical and extra-biblical sources as Molech or Melcom, a deity whose very name reflects kingship, derived from the Semitic root meaning king. Milcom was more than a god of war or fertility. He was the embodiment of Ammonite national identity, the divine protector of the kingdom, and the guarantor of the king's authority. Archaeological evidence, including statues and inscriptions from Rabbath Ammon dating from circa 850 BCE to 650 BCE, depicts Milcom as a seated figure, sometimes flanked by symbols of power or worshippers offering gifts. These visual representations suggest a god intimately tied to the royal court, whose favor was considered essential for both domestic stability and military success. The worship of Milcom is most notorious for its association with ritual sacrifices, particularly those condemned in the Hebrew Bible. Passages such as 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 7 and 2 Kings chapter 23 verse 10 describe practices in which children were passed through fire in dedication to Milcom. While scholars debate whether these references describe literal child sacrifice or symbolic rituals involving fire, the biblical authors consistently frame these practices as morally abhorrent, contrasting them with the worship of Yahweh. Some archaeologists, including William F. Albright, argue that evidence from the region, such as cremation pyres and votive figurines, may support the occurrence of sacrificial rites, suggesting that Ammonite religion incorporated extreme acts of devotion to secure divine favor for the kingdom or royal family. Yet Milcom was not the only figure in the Ammonite pantheon. Archaeological and epigraphic evidence indicates that other deities were also venerated, likely representing aspects of fertility, agriculture, and local spirits. Small shrines, amulets, and inscriptions suggest the presence of minor gods and goddesses, though their names are rarely preserved. Some scholars, examining iconography on seals and stelae, propose that lunar worship, possibly inherited from Mesopotamian influence, played a role in Ammonite religious life, emphasizing the syncretic nature of their belief system. The integration of multiple deities reflects a culture receptive to foreign influences while maintaining core elements of indigenous worship, which reinforced communal identity and legitimacy. The temples of Ammonite society were central to both religious and civic life. Excavations around modern Amman have revealed altars, cultic installations and monumental buildings that likely functioned as sites for public worship, festivals, and administrative activities. Inscriptions found within these spaces often invoke Milcom directly, detailing offerings, dedications, and petitions for protection or prosperity. Kings, in particular, are depicted in inscriptions as intermediaries between the people and Milcom, performing rituals intended to legitimize their rule and unify the population under shared religious obligations. These public displays of devotion reinforce the intertwining of political and religious authority, making piety both a personal and state duty. The moral and theological implications of Ammonite religion are highlighted in Israelite texts. Prophets such as Jeremiah and Ezekiel condemned the Ammonites for their idolatry, emphasizing that their attachment to Milcom and other deities symbolized spiritual rebellion and cruelty. Jeremiah, for instance, denounces the Ammonites rejoicing over Judah's suffering, while Ezekiel portrays their worship practices as offensive to God. These texts illustrate the deep tension between Ammonite religious practices and Israelite ethical norms, framing the Ammonites as both neighbors and moral counterpoints to the Israelites. The biblical portrayal, while polemical, provides a window into the significance of religion in Ammonite society and its role in defining both identity and intergroup relations. Ritual practice was also integrated into everyday life. Offerings were made not only in temples but in household shrines, indicating that religious observance permeated private and public spheres. Household inscriptions, small figurines, and votive objects found across the Ammonite heartland suggest that devotion to Milcom and other deities was a constant presence, shaping agricultural cycles, legal obligations, and social customs. Scholars have noted that the pervasiveness of religious observance helped maintain cohesion in a kingdom composed of multiple clans and towns, providing a shared framework of belief that transcended local variation. The religion of the Ammonites reflects both continuity with and divergence from the broader Canaanite world. While they shared linguistic, cultural, and ritual traits with neighboring peoples such as the Moabites and Edomites, their particular emphasis on Milcom, the integration of extreme sacrificial practices, and the explicit intertwining of royal authority with divine sanction created a distinctive religious identity. This combination of local tradition, foreign influence, and ritual intensity ensured that Ammonite religion was simultaneously familiar to their neighbors and deeply threatening in moral and theological terms. Understanding the gods of Ammon, especially Milcom, is therefore essential not only to the study of ancient Near Eastern religion, but also to understanding the historical and cultural lens through which the Ammonites were perceived by Israel and later generations. Ammon and Israel, a relationship written in conflict. The Ammonites and Israelites shared a history marked by cycles of conflict, uneasy alliances, and intense rivalry that extended over centuries. From the earliest biblical accounts, the Ammonites are portrayed as both kin and adversary. Their shared ancestry, traced back to Lot in Genesis chapter 19 verse 38, created a complicated relationship in which proximity did not guarantee peace. During the period of the Judges, the Ammonites and Israelites clashed over control of territory east of the Jordan River, particularly around the fertile plains of the Jabbok River. These disputes were often framed in biblical texts as struggles between the worshippers of Yahweh and those devoted to Milcom, establishing a theological dimension to territorial conflict that reinforced social and religious boundaries. One of the earliest recorded conflicts occurred during the time of Jephthah, a judge of Israel described in Judges chapters 10 through 12, who led Israelite forces against the Ammonites. The Ammonites had encroached upon Israelite territory, demanding tribute and asserting dominance over the eastern settlements. Jephthah, despite his controversial vow that ultimately led to the sacrifice of his daughter, demonstrated Israelite military and religious resolve in confronting a people whose origins were closely tied to their own. This story illustrates both the military capability of the Ammonites and the moral framing applied by Israelite authors, portraying Ammonite aggression as a test of Israelite faith and obedience to Yahweh. During the United Monarchy, the relationship became more politically complex. King Saul, reigning circa 1050 BCE to 1010 BCE, faced repeated Ammonite incursions and organized campaigns to secure Israelite borders along the eastern frontier. The Ammonites, organized under their own kings, were capable of fielding armies that posed a serious threat to Israelite towns and trade routes. In some cases, they allied with Moabite or Edomite forces to amplify their military power, highlighting a level of strategic diplomacy and regional cooperation that challenged Israelite authority. Archaeological evidence suggests that fortifications along the eastern Jordan, including Israelite and Ammonite sites, reflect a long-standing tension between these neighboring peoples. The rise of King David, circa 1010 BCE to 970 BCE, further complicated the dynamics between Israel and Ammon. The biblical narrative recounts that David led multiple campaigns against the Ammonites, culminating in the siege of Rabbath Ammon, the Ammonite capital, described in 2 Samuel chapters 10 and 12. These campaigns, according to the text, were initially sparked by diplomatic offences but evolved into full-scale military confrontations. While the biblical account emphasizes Davidite heroism, it also reflects the Ammonites' resilience and organizational capacity. Even when subjected to prolonged sieges, Ammonite forces demonstrated a capacity for sustained defense, underscoring the strategic advantages conferred by their geography and fortified settlements. Diplomatic interactions between Israel and Ammon were not uniformly hostile. Marriages, alliances, and temporary truces occurred during periods of mutual interest. For instance, biblical texts indicate that King Solomon, circa 970 BCE to 931 BCE, established marital ties with neighboring peoples, including Ammonite women, and at times allowed the integration of their religious practices into broader societal worship, though such actions were later criticized by prophets for compromising Israelite religious purity, as noted in 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 1 through 7. These periods of peace and integration suggest that Ammonite society was not solely defined by conflict, but by the negotiation of political and cultural identity in a complex regional landscape. Scholars have also noted that Ammonite-Israelite interactions were shaped by the broader geopolitical pressures of the ancient Near East. The expansion of empires such as Assyria, circa 900 BCE to 600 BCE, and Babylon, circa 600 BCE to 539 BCE, forced smaller kingdoms to navigate vassalage, tribute, and occasional military cooperation. Inscriptions from the region indicate that Ammonite kings, including Peduel, acknowledged Assyrian authority while maintaining local autonomy, a political strategy that allowed them to survive amid regional upheaval. These interactions with the empire also influenced the Ammonites' approach to Israel, balancing diplomacy, alliance, and warfare according to changing circumstances. The relationship between Ammon and Israel was shaped by geography, shared ancestry, and competing religious and political ideologies. Their conflicts were as much about territory and trade as they were about identity, belief, and legitimacy. The Ammonites' worship of Milcom and Israel's devotion to Yahweh created a framework in which military and theological rivalry were intertwined. Understanding these interactions, from the time of the Judges through the monarchic period, provides insight into how religion, politics, and culture intersected in the ancient Near East, and why the Ammonites were remembered not merely as neighbors or adversaries, but as a people whose identity was inseparable from both their divine patron and their enduring defiance of Israelite norms.